Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The Chinese maritime affairs. They've got the largest navy in the world, and they are threatening to become even larger. Platforms like 3 aircraft carriers is on the plans, and of course, they talk about 11 aircraft carriers. What are they doing all this stuff for? What do they want in the oceans? And the biggest question I keep asking again and again and again: have the Chinese been trying to, I'm going to use a word very lightly, play around with us in the Himalayas so that they keep our eyes away from the oceans? To bring our eyes here to the oceans, I have with me Dr. Pooja Bhatt, who's a scholar, quite inquisitive about maritime security, Asian security. She's working with the Raksha University, Rashtriya Raksha University, CAPS India, and many other think tanks. It's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Pooja, on the show, and hoping to kind of having a very nice this interaction and going forward to many many such interactions in the future. Thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Adi, for having me. I'm really glad to be here and talking about the areas and issues which have intrigued me for the longest time. And I'm glad to share my ideas and thoughts on these topics. And I'll be happy to take, some kind of comments if there are. And let's just, the brainstorm issues together, maybe.
Absolutely wonderful. Okay, let me just start off with a very silly question. What's up with China? What's his problem in the oceans? And let's stick to the oceans around it.
Okay, so I am glad that if you're putting it in this manner, there's no problem with China. I think China is being pretty sane about they are doing, despite we all saying that China has gone crazy and Xi Jinping has no plan and he's going berserk with his whatever power he has received right now. There is a method behind madness. All right, that's the thing I would say. China is very clear under Xi Jinping that they have to become the superpower in the world, and they have no, and it's not a new thing. Started something before him in 2013 when Hu Jintao was the president of China. He had come out with his vision in his white paper in 2030 that how China wants to become the global power, and for this they need to control the oceans and they need to go out to towards the world. They need to participate more on the international level issues. That was set out in 2013, and then fast forward in 2016-17 when President Xi Jinping came into power, he realized that there was a huge dream behind it, and all he wanted is to put it into execution. So there were two ways he was doing it. First of all, going about grabbing the grabbing in the sense expanding his land territories, using all the ways possible, whether it was military, whether it was using history in ambiguous manner, because most of the histories were unwritten around, so it was very easy to work around history and produce certain kind of documents later and say certain era this place used to be mine, and I can always come back and it is again mine. Another way it did was using economics. It realized that in the end it has to become a superpower. To become a superpower, there are two things necessary. One, the economic power has to there, and to support that, military power is important. Economic power requires a lot of energy in every development. If you talk about infrastructure, if you talk about industries, anything you talk about, you require energy. So he thought that more energy I will have in energy resources, I mean, for this, I will have more energy resources. I'll be more economically developed country, and more I can secure that with the military will make me more powerful. Another thing that came into hindrance was its own backyard. So unlike its neighbors, it is China is surrounded with at least 14 neighbors, and except I think India, it has resolved most of its border issues. So what it realized that my northern borders are still secure. I've had most of the border agreements with most of the countries in my neighborhood. That's taken care of, but my maritime borders still remain unsettled. And in the sense, I have 5 or 6 neighbors, and I need to and this is also area where from where I can I have to be very, placed myself in that area powerfully before I can even go out in the further region. So this area can become either do or die for me. So I need to grab the South China Sea area, which is the maritime backyard. It not only provides me the energy security and everything in the backyard, but also placing its own forces in the, somewhere in the Spratly Islands, which is 400 nautical miles away from the Hainan, which is the southernmost part of China. It gives you immense multiplying effect to your air power, your sea power, and everything. So I think with all these, master plan, I think China has been approaching since, and everything that you can see in this schematic, you can fit that every activity that is happening right now across the land borders, across the maritime borders, it is in the schema of things that everything is happening.
You've brought out something which is very interesting, and for a novice China watcher, one really thinks that this is a method with, all this is happening without a plan. But as you dig deeper, as you very rightly said, that you realize that there is a certain amount of plan that he's trying to achieve, even with his land acquisitions, if I may, of Tibet and Xinjiang and all that stuff. This has been part of a plan that was written a long time ago by, of course, Dr. Sun Yat-sen in 1922. I
Exactly.
want to ask you about the South China Sea in specific before we move on to the larger scope of the Indo-Pacific. The South China Sea is crowded today, and one of the things that I want to ask you is that, is China now going to decide to pick a fight? It's got issues with Japan, it's got issues with Taiwan, it's got issues with India, it's got issues, of course, with Russia, which are on the back burner right now. We can't, let's just let it be. Uh, but is South China Sea the place that the Chinese have decided? Okay, this is the place I want to pick my fight. They have a varied choice, and they have their resistance as well. They know with India they might just have a heavy problem, and that's pretty evident in their writing. But the Japanese, they're aware that the Americans might just come in and create some trouble. SAS Taiwan, South China Sea is a scope where they could kind of play around without much pushback from the greater powers of the world. So, is this the place that the Chinese will pick as their next fight?
Okay, that's a very interestingly put question. I'll see it why. Um, See, no country would want its neighborhood to be volatile if it wants its own security, stability, development. So, same as India, same as any other country, that you would not want your neighborhood to be volatile, right? So, if that is the thought process, China would not want South China Sea to be volatile, because anything happening in South China Sea, its own 80-85% of the trade comes from there. I think more than that. I think recent 2023 trade figures I've not seen, but I think the trade would be even higher. So anything happening in South China Sea, any kind of war happening in Taiwan, or skirmishes happening with Vietnam, Philippines, it will eventually end up hurting its own economic benefits, which is the last thing I think China would want. So I do not agree with the fact when even anyone would talk about that, China would want a war with this country. No, it would not, because more than anyone else, it would end up hurting itself or its own economic development. And currently, whatever China says, that whatever economic projection is showing to the world, we know a lot of Chinese scholars, and even you, if you have been following, China itself has domestically has been facing a lot of economic issues, right? So I don't think that's the thing. But at the same time, being the most powerful country in that region, China is trying to, put its foot down that, this region, these um, islands belong to me. Now it's stopped saying entire nine dash belongs to me. However, if you see, most of the recent Chinese activities in terms of research vessels and oil rigs that have been seen, doing excavation and energy, whatever research that they've been doing, have been along the dotted lines. You can, if you overlap those, excavation points as well over the nine dash line, you would see most of them are, they overlap. So even if China is not using nine dash line, I've not seen China using since 2016 that term, that and they have been very clear about showing their power projection around the Spratlys and Paris in Scarborough Shoal. These three areas mostly they've been showing its power. But in it wants to do both. It wants to have its military and presence within these islands to show its power projection, because once your Spratlys are covered, it gives you further power. Once that foothold is there, it gives you further power to break through the first island chain. They need to come out because they're covered from, they're encircled with the countries. They need to break through that U-shaped circle, U-shape whatever shape, so that they can just break through the first island chain. At the same time, they would want that oil resources and the marine resources which are there, and which is again a part of economic development for the country. So they would want it all. They just want to exert their uh, power in that area and not pick up fights, because every time it comes to a skirmish, China will bilaterally go and talk out with that country. If you've seen, all their high level ministers would be moving around and start talking immediately. So they do not want a war, very clearly. So that's how I see it. It does not want any kind of a volatile neighborhood, but it also wants to project its power that this area belongs to me, and I will keep poking in these areas because it's mine. That kind of thing.
Isn't that a very ironic policy to have?
I tell you, there is a method to madness, and there would be hardly any king, if you read about powerful king, who would not have the kind of this madness to his ways of working towards war. So I think you can compare with that. That's a more bigger problem. You cannot predict China. China is not dangerous because it has its more powerful military and economics or whatever. The danger is you can't predict what China is going to do next, and I think that's the part it
Yeah,
plays on.
yeah, yeah. That's one of the reasons why there are Pakistan experts at the dime a dozen, but China experts very rare and few to find. Um, I want to talk about actually the you mentioned the first island chain, and with the recent actions in the Solomon and in trying to do something in Fiji, and putting his, for the lack of a better word, trying to put his fingers, kuch to aa jaye yaar haath mein, somebody talk
Hmm.
to me, and sort of a thing,
Hmm.
with the same kind of actions, which are, of course, I've covered this extensively about the letter that was written by a president of one of these island nations, and it was a 13-page letter talking about the Chinese, how they actually operate within their countries and try and change the perception of people, try and drive people through, and this and that. The interesting point that I want to talk about is the Solomon Islands. Is by actually getting a foothold there, has he not just skipped the first island chain to go move ahead? And isn't this what he would like to do going into the future? And isn't that why we see suddenly the US, India, and multiple other countries starting to engage with Papua New Guinea, with Fiji, and multiple other island nations within that region?
Thankfully to China, all the discarded places now are getting attention. Sorry to use word discarded because nobody paid attention to them beforehand. Now, see Latin America, see African countries. Nobody paid attention for their development and doing whatever trade with them. Island countries, nobody even talk about it. Even in India, we just have used to have some presence in Fiji Islands, and we used to randomly talk about one's island chain. Like it's too far and it doesn't matter to a foreign policy objectives and whatever. So thanks to China, the tension has come back. See, for China, again, as you rightly pointed, that it's kind of skipping that, island chain because it realizes that Guam is there and then there are US allies encircling it. So, otherwise, it's like a play, you have this mahjong, that game is there that you skip your enemy one over other. So it's that kind of game that they kind of play. They understand that within South China Sea, they can still, have some kind of control. First island chain is not very easy to break because US is present in Guam, and then there are US allies encircling, including Philippines and some kind of presence in other countries as well. And then South Korea, Japan again is there on its eastern border. So immediately jumping to the next thing is overtaking its relations with these island countries, and more importantly Solomon and Fiji Islands, which are also closer to other countries like Australia. It's kind of giving a signal that we can come up to that extent. Uh, But from that country perspective, if you see, the only reason I think they would have given a chance to China is that they seek development. They've been long ignored by everyone, including Australia itself. Australia had whatever its trade relations and somewhat cultural relations, but on and off, these island countries have been ignored, and they kind of need that kind of money for their economic sustainability and everything. So China is ready to give that, and in lieu of it, China wants its own presence. So I think that is the kind of thing that they're trying to play. In every place where there is low development and countries are seeking money, China is coming up. I can provide you money. You just provide me a place. It's the give and take of game. Interestingly, I think by the time it's China's ties with the Fiji Islands have come. Sorry, Solomon Islands have come up. I think these island countries had turned really wiser, in terms of seeing experiences with China's experience with other countries. So even if we saw this kind of camaraderie between Solomon and China, immediately we saw US jumping in the wagon, coming up with its own agenda with the island countries. And if you compare both agendas, like China's agenda with the island countries and US agenda with they match neck to neck in every area. Means talk about science technology, so talk about marine development, talk about climate change, talk about green energy. Same agenda both have provided. So I think that way US has now what is trying to do is, uh, initially they never recognized these recognized some never showed any interest in these countries, and now when China has come up with its proposals, US has proposed absolutely same proposal, providing an alternative to all these island countries to work with either of them, like giving them options. You work with China, and same proposals I'm giving to you, work with me. And in the end, everyone in the world, in their hearts, know it's safer to work with the US than with China. None are better than other, but at least with US, you can hold them accountable. That accountability is a factor with China, which world can play around with. I think the only only reason why India is also invited is that despite everything, India might not have that kind of economic viability for them, or any kind of, we can't do much for them economically and whatever, but we have that trust factor. Indians keep a trust factor within Fiji and Solomon Islands and all these, because we've been present there in certain centuries back, and also Indians per se have that kind of um, uh, belief system which the rest of the
Especially,
world
yeah.
believes. So I think that
Yeah,
was a long answer, but I was just trying to
no, no, no.
make you understand.
That's perfectly good. I think because it's about a mindset at the end of it. That's what China is trying to play on with,
Correct.
and one of the very simplest ways of explaining this is China sees a gap and China finds a corrupt leader who he contacts and he says, "Listen, I don't care if your brother-in-law gets rich, but this is what I want. Get this
Hmm.
done and let's move forward." And that's what we've
Correct.
seen as a trend in Africa. We've seen that in Pakistan. We've seen that in multiple nations. You mentioned the breakout again, and I just want to take 2 minutes in that. The Taiwan issue is, of course, a very very interesting issue with political turmoil within Taiwan coming forth with the election. Uh, with it going one way or the other, Chinese stand to gain quite a bit, and in their standing within the region. If there are certain voices in the KMT which are being heard today, so there's that, and then there is of course Tsai Ing-wen who's pushing in for that uh, aggressive, defensive, democratic stand.
Hmm.
Uh, there are these murky issues which are there about the ADIZ and not recognition, and this and that and the other. Uh, the factor that I kind of wonder about sometimes is what if Taiwan votes KMT? Doesn't that open the South China Sea for China in a non confrontational manner? And it's like what the Chinese like to do, winning a war without fight.
So if I understand correctly, if China wins the election in Taiwan, like in the
No,
sense
no,
of
no.
having
The
its own
KMT wins the election in Taiwan, which
KMT
is the
wins in.
pro-China party. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
isn't that
Okay.
like a clear sign of victory for China?
See, Taiwan has grown, at least this generation we can speak of, has grown into democratic system. It's despite whatever China projections are there, despite Chinese propaganda within Taiwan and abroad. I think the people over there are quite convinced that they do not want a model of governance which is undemocratic. I think which is a very powerful thing to keep in mind before even we think about. Like only way I would say, and some of my colleagues who watch this issue might agree that only way China might get to win Taiwan is having more militarily aggressive posture, because in terms of people, if you talk about, and they are the ones who elect the governments. I think that none of the current generation would be voting in terms of anything related to KMT or any model of government which is not democratic as per them. They have grown into it. So yeah, I don't see it happening this way, but we can always debate about that.
Yeah, absolutely, you never know. Elections are weird. Recent events has actually seen a militarization activity happening from the West, from US, from the British, from small activity from the French, and we've seen this suddenly build up. And currently, even there are two aircraft carriers from the US sitting there. There are exercises happening and this and that. So there's a lot of militarism which has started up in the South China Sea, Sea of Japan, sort of a region which is pretty much the central Indo-Pacific. Uh, how do you see this over militarization of this region? And is this going to be a norm going future in the future?
You pointed out a very correct thing. I think if you do a SIPRI study, so SIPRI comes out with this, yearbook, and they tell which is the most militarized countries of the year of the decade and region of the decade. Asia consistently is been on the top in terms of top, arms importers. Most militarization, if you see, in terms of incoming and outgoing of warships and aircraft carriers and aircraft, fighter aircrafts and all that. In terms of nuclear weapons, the most nuclear weapons are coming up in this region. I think now we are slowly and but gradually being the most militarized region. You're correct. South China Sea has itself a lot of issues. Like you're talking about Japan, that Japan is consistent now. More China is pushing towards Japan, and Senkaku Island. Japan is pushing out even more. They even changed their constitution, which was off since 1947 45. It was pacifist, and all of a sudden they are changing to they want to become they want to have military forces, and they want to have start purchasing and selling nuclear, sorry, not nuclear, so the conventional weapons and platforms. So I think these kind of changes, if you see, and again, North Korea again makes a strong case. Year on year, they are building up nuclear missiles and systems. So I think the presence of all these rogue countries in one region, and all of a sudden they are all turning rogue for whatever reasons, maybe the right wing governments all over, and the sudden surge of very nationalist movements all over the whatever reasons you talk about. But all of a sudden, South China Sea definitely has become the center of lot of concern in terms of militarization. Even the smallest countries. Which have barely any budget to feed themselves, like Brunei and Laos and Cambodia, suddenly they are surging their defense budgets, which is very concerning. They're barely sustaining themselves, and they are increasing their defense budget. So all in all, this region is going to look even more dangerous in the coming years. That's what I keep on saying, everywhere. It's a
Absolutely, and
scary time.
that that's the whole thing. A small little mistake somewhere uh, with such a crowded little sea, and it's not a very vast scope of vast, open oceans that there can be so many different powers floating around with their flotillas in that area. It's a powder keg, if I may. And going forward, it's only going to become further and further more, dangerous. Coming towards closer to home, the Indian Ocean has been on the Chinese Navy's radar for a little bit, and we know they're doing mapping in that region uh,
Hmm.
they, because they're worried about the WS-84 kind of going out of sync when when and if the balloon does go up. We know they're doing this mapping. We know that they're sending these so-called spy ships to spy on India. But we know the real purpose now, which is pretty evident with regards to what they did with the balloons, with a whole lot of other things. So one realizes that the Chinese is kind of pushing out a hardcore effort in terms of mapping the oceans.
Mm.
Uh, but having said that, the Chinese haven't been focusing with regards to their security interests within the region, except for Hambantota, where they try and bring something all the time to create some sort of a tamasha or probably do whatever their missions are. How do you see them kind of moving into or trying to move into the Indian Ocean and trying to see uh, what they can be and where they can be? And of course, what do they notice about Indian maritime uh, activities? And of course, that is a big threat to them because of the size of the Indian Navy itself. How do you see this entire game opening out into the future?
Correct. So it is like this. China wants to be, it's again starts from domestic politics. Okay, China wants to become blue water navy. Blue water navy should be capable of holding itself in far off waters for extended number of days. So they, just can venture out for 100 plus days, 200, 300 days out and away from the coastline. In order to do so, it has to come out from its safe shell of South China Sea, right? They need to venture out both in Pacific and Indian Ocean. The thing is, Pacific Ocean is already crowded with U.S. presence, and there's formidable U.S. presence. So I think they would try less going that side, more coming towards this side of the their own western border, because you have Africa, then you can also reach Latin America after extended time.
Resources. Mm.
Resources for resources. Okay, so to be able to do so, Indian Ocean per se, if you talk about its maritime phenomena, it's bathymetry, like the salinity and the temperatures are very different from that of Pacific. And I was having this chat with the NIOT, National Institute of Ocean Technology, head director. So I was just asking why, Indian Ocean, why are we not exploring Indian Ocean? And China is doing everything, and we are just sitting on a, doing nothing. We have so many blocks available to us by ISA, and we are not going and digging. And he was very clear, what do you oceans are different in each area. The ocean is different. Indian Ocean is far difficult from what we see in Pacific Ocean. It's not easy to navigate Indian Ocean waters beneath the equator. If you talk about, it's not easy to dig sink your vessels and for the extended time, because the salinity and temperatures are such that most of the vessels cannot. Human presence is not easy for extendable times, because the temperatures and waters and maritime environment is such. So understanding that Indian Ocean is definitely difficult to navigate for every country, including China.
Mm.
And to understand, to be present here, to do excavations for this energy resources, to come out from South China Sea, traverse all the way, all these days to Atlantic and onwards. China needs to have those kind of capabilities. But what capabilities it will develop will be based upon what are the conditions there. How to find out the condition to send your research vessels, right? So they are sending those research vessels, correct? They are also doing a lot of spying and snooping all over, which is again any research vessel would do. So we are on the edge for that also. But more importantly, what is trying to do is understand how deep and which areas its submarines can go, where what are the tranches and crevices where its submarines and vessels can traverse. What are the areas for its ship lines to traverse, what are the safer lines. So these kind of researches are being done mostly, which is very important for long term. Okay, to move beyond its South China Sea, traverse the entire Indian Ocean, reach Africa and beyond. So if you see all the researches happening in this area, has a important component of these basic kind of researches happening. We do not know oceans enough. So basically, we need to learn about oceans. We need to know what's going on. So that is one part of it, and another part of it is to see to it also remains to the Chinese Navy also remains to remain supplied, right? It would need the food, the oil, the spare parts, and everything. one of the reasons, one of the things that it will make it a true blue water navy is that it's going till Latin America. It can stop in Hambantota, get its food, get its supplies, get its spares, move on. That finished, then it will go to Djibouti, and Djibouti, it will replenish itself for its entire, big flotilla, move on to Atlantic, oh sorry, your Latin American country. So these are the ways, it is going, the reason they have the bases, and reason that they're doing all this kind of researches is somewhat, all interlinked with each other.
Interesting. This has been an interesting chat because when you're talking about a region as per se and maritime security, it's a subject that a lot of people don't talk about. It's spoken about by military naval experts, and I've done that. But actually getting a different perspective with regards to trade and a whole lot of other things is interesting. So my last question to you is, China seems to be in a bit of a hurry. He's got issues with regards to his economy, demography. He's got internal stability issues. The focus of the great powers of the world seems to be shifting back towards China from Russia again, with the recent statements coming out of G7, which was mostly focused on China rather than Russia, and that was a big surprise to me.
Yeah.
Do you think the Chinese, in their hurry to do something, would be pushed into a mistake in the region of the South China Sea?
So you mean to say that now they see
A
that
military mistake.
that they would try to do something militarily more aggressive in the region?
Yeah.
Uh, See, one of the things is, I think one recently I read, like today morning, one of the U.S. Strategists was saying that this war might extend to another year, the Ukraine war. So if that is the case, I don't think that China would want to do it. But the global pressure that has been, coming down, like Ukraine 1 year prior and Ukraine now, people have moved on with the things and not concerning. Um, I'm not sure if China would want the Taiwan to become a touchy point at the moment. Do anything quite aggressive in Taiwan at the moment, because it's its own. The entire calculation is, now when the war has come down, China would want to increase its global presence, and doing anything of Taiwan style, or going with a skirmish with either Philippines or Vietnam, it has increased the cases of its presence in Stratlys and everything. But I still do not see China going overtly military with either of the regions, because it has seen how the world has responded to Ukraine. Ukraine never got a overt support, but NATO, whatever they did, despite saying that they would not be able to do, Ukraine is still getting a lot of support from the rest of the world. So whatever said and done, Taiwan has that kind of reputation in the world. That I agree that there are only 13 countries who recognize officially Taiwan as a country, but otherwise, if you see, a lot more countries have sympathy towards the Taiwan issue. So the moment China would try to do anything aggressive at this moment, I think it will just blow off the lid. I don't think China would want to try anything nasty at this time, when the entire global economy is low, when the entire public sympathies towards no war. So in these kind of situation, it's really hard to say. I can be proven wrong, but if I make sense out of the current issues from past 1 year, it would be a very bad timing for China to go aggressive right now. At least now with the elections also coming, it will work against its own favor in
Mm.
Taiwan.
In Taiwan. Thank you so much. This has been a great opener of an episode, and I'm sure I'd like to plan a lot more with you, because the maritime affairs is something which is going to be in focus for a long, long time to come. And I stand by, and you've kind of reinforced my position of the fact that we've been kept busy in the north so that we ignore the south. And this is something that we as Indians need to understand a little more. I'd like to thank you and for your time and your effort and your the knowledge that you've given us. It's something that will help us taking the understanding of what's happening in the oceans a little forward. Till next time for another interesting subject about China and trying to figure out what Xi Jinping thinks about when he wakes up in the morning. Jai Hind.
Thank you for having me.